Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another of our Wednesday morning lecture series. We're really pleased, or I am certainly pleased, as a historian, sort of, to be able to invite Kendall Cornwell back once more to tell us all about President Teddy Roosevelt. And the one thing that sticks in my mind about Teddy Roosevelt was, speak softly but carry a big stick, which I always thought was good advice. And so I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Kendall Cornwell.
I'm going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt today, and I'm basically going to focus in on his personal life. And then we're going to, in his early personal life, it's kind of an introduction. And then I'm going to talk about his time down the River of Doubt. That was in Brazil. So Theodore Roosevelt, a fascinating man. He was born October 27th, 1859. He was born to a very wealthy family in New York. As a matter of fact, his grandfather was probably one of the wealthiest men in New York. He had one brother and two sisters, and his father's name was Theodore Roosevelt Sr., and his mother was a Southern belle from Georgia, and her name was Martha Bullock, although they called her Mittie. And there's some talk that possibly Margaret Mitchell used Roosevelt's parents as kind of a inspiration for Scarlett and Rhett. But I don't know if that's true. He suffered from terrible asthma. The family was not sure he was going to live past 4. His father, Theodore Sr., also known as Greatheart, would walk the floor with him, take him on buggy rides to clear his lungs. His father was very motherly. His father would mean the world to him. His parents and doctor, when he was a small boy, had him drink coffee and smoke cigars for his asthma. Yeah, cigars will really help. But the coffee was not far off, actually. Theodore wrote in his diary that once they rubbed his chest so hard that it made blood come out. As a child, he read adult books. He had a photographic memory and would talk about what he had read in a loud voice to anyone who would listen. As he grew older, his father told him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but not the body." His father gave him boxing lessons, set up a gym for him at home to work out, took him on hikes to Maine. His father told him, "Get action, seize the day. Don't worry about your mental or emotional state. Get out, do things, don't sit, don't worry." And I would say that is pretty good advice for everybody today. I know that when I get out and get action, I feel better, usually. Anyway, Theodore took this advice all his life. He took it to heart. He actually carried it, I think, to an extreme. But anyway, it was from his mother he got his romantic notions. Mittie would tell him romantic tales of the Old West, of duels and chivalry. Theodore was home tutored, and when he was 17 years old, he went to Harvard. At Harvard, he joined every club he could. He would run from class to class. He swam and ran for miles at a time. He was so loud in class and full of opinions and information that in one class, the professor said, "See here, Roosevelt, I'm teaching this class." His asthma improved greatly away from home. He would write long letters to his mother, who he called his darling motherling. And his father was Old Governor. In late 1877, Theodore's father started to have severe intestinal pain. By the beginning of February in 1876, Theodore's father had died an agonizing death of stomach cancer. It would be the first of a number of tragedies that would darken Roosevelt's life. For months afterwards, Theodore would pour out his hurt feelings and anguish into his diary. "Oh, Father, Father," he wrote, "how bitterly I miss you, mourn you, and long for you." He ran, hiked, and rode his horse Lightfoot almost to death. blasted away at a Sharps rifle with birds, bottles, and anything else. At one point, somebody's dog came out and kind of chased his horse and barked at him, and Roosevelt shot the dog dead. And I'm not sure that was supposed to be funny, but that shows you how sad he was over his father's death. Action would be what would save him. Late that year in October, a window opened for him, and he met a cousin of a close friend, Alice Hathaway Lee. Later, he said it was love at first sight, his only love. Forgetting his childhood friend and love, Edith Carow, he wrote the following February, "I do not think ever a man loved a woman more than I love her. I doubt if an hour has passed that I have not thought of her." They became engaged. On his 27th birthday, October 27th, 1880, Alice Lee and Theodore were married. Do you all realize he was married twice? Alice Lee Roosevelt emerges as a shadowy figure. Beautiful but so light and airy there is almost nothing to say of her. There are only a few letters from her. She comes across time as beautiful, spoiled, sweet, affectionate, loving, but not deep. Just before the wedding, she wrote him in 1880, "My own dearest Teddy." And she was the one that started to call him Teddy. And she was the only one that he liked to call him Teddy. After she died, when people called him Teddy, he would get very upset. He did not want people calling him Teddy. It was Theodore, or Mr. President, or whatever. "My own dearest Teddy, how I wish it was 3 weeks from today, our wedding day. I just long to be with you all of the time and never separated from you. Teddykins, Teddykins. I know that you can make me happy, and you must never think it would have not been better for me if we had never met. I shall die without you now, Teddy, and there is not another man I could ever have loved in the world." During their first 2 weeks together, Theodore wrote, "It is impossible to describe the lovely little teasing ways of my bright, bewitching darling. I can't imagine no picture so pretty as her sweet self, seated behind the tea things in the daintiest little pink and gray morning dress. I am living in a dream world. How I wish it could go on forever." It could not. Months later, they took a real honeymoon to Europe. Theodore wrote home to his sister Bammy, "We had a beautiful passage, very nearly as gay as a funeral. If ever a person heartily enjoyed a sea trip, Alice did. She enjoyed it so much that she stayed in bed about all the time, the steward and myself being her devoted attendants. I fed her every blessed meal she ate, and held her head when about 20 minutes later the meal came galloping up to the outer world again. Every half an hour during the night I turned out to supervise matters, while Alice went through some kind of a stomach earthquake. After each one of these internal convulsions, Alice concluded that she was going to die, and we would have a mental circus for a few minutes. Finally, after I implored, prayed, and swore with equal ferocity, she would again compose herself for a few minutes. Alice was really awfully sick. Later, they reached terra firma, and he wrote of her again, saying Alice is an excellent traveler. Going on to say, when I reach a station, I leave her in a chair with parcels, and there she stays, round-eyed and solemn, but perfectly happy, till I extract my luggage, had it put on a hack, and arrange everything. Alice also had trouble with the natives. She resented it as an impertinence if she was addressed in any language but English. So this gives you some clue to spoiled little Alice's personality. His second wife, Edith, his childhood friend and sweetheart, would be able to talk with him on any intelligible level. Nor was she spoiled like Alice. It makes you wonder if he would have still been enchanted with his spoiled child bride as President of the United States. They moved in with Roosevelt's family in New York with his mothers and sisters. He became deeply involved in politics. He was one of the first men of the upper class to become involved in politics. Even though newly married, he finished a book he had been writing, The Naval History of 1812. And you can still get that book, I believe. One of the many books he would write, which became a bestseller. He ran for the New York Assembly and won, divided his time between his family and the Assembly in Albany. Alice and he became the hit of the affluent New York social scene. By 1883, Alice was pregnant. Roosevelt's mother commented on how very large she looked at one time. But it seemed that Alice's pregnancy went on without any problems that she or anyone else could tell. Either that, or she was not saying she was having problems. By February 11th, Roosevelt's mother was very sick with what seemed like a hard cold. On Tuesday, February 13th, Theodore had gone back to the State Assembly in Albany. That night, Alice went into labor and gave birth to a baby girl. At first, all seemed fine. Roosevelt was cabled that he was a father. But a few hours later, he got another cable, "Come home quick." His mother and wife were running a race with death. Mittie was dying of typhoid fever, Alice of Bright's disease. By the time Theodore got home and took Alice in his arms, she hardly knew him. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he was told if he wanted to see his mother alive, he had better go to her. At 3 o'clock, his mother was dead. Alice lingered on another 11 hours. At 2 in the afternoon the next day, Alice was dead at 22 years of age. Theodore was still holding her. The baby lived. And the baby is Alice Roosevelt Longworth. I'm sure you all can remember her. She was quite influential in Washington, even in the 60s. She was. She always said, "If you have something bad to say, come sit next to me." You didn't want to cross her. He never got over it, nor would he ever talk about it, or he tried not to talk about it. He did talk about it, but not very much. Roosevelt spent the rest of his life trying not to speak her name again. In his autobiography, he does not even write about her. He had little interest in the child and gave her to his sister Bammy to take care of. After the double funeral, the following Monday, Roosevelt went back to his seat in the Assembly. For the next few months, he did nothing but work. That June, he went to the National Republic Convention. The year before, he had bought a cattle ranch in the Badlands of Dakota. After the convention, he went to his ranch. He would stay on and off for the next 3 years. And in his own mind, he became a cowboy. His fellow cowboys just thought he was very strange and would laugh at him. He had a woman make a leather shirt and pants for $100, and that was back in the 1880s. So today, that shirt and pants would be like $1,000, $2,000. According to David McCullen in Morning on Horseback, he had spent a small fortune to look the part. Besides the big hat, the buckskin shirt, chaps, bridle, silver spurs, he had fancy alligator boots, a silver-mounted Bowie knife by Tiffany. His silver belt buckle was engraved with the head of a bear. His silver spurs had his initials on them. His Colt revolver was engraved with scrolls and geometric patterns and plated with silver and gold. On one side of the ivory handle were his initials. On the other, the head of a buffalo, to commemorate the one he shot in 1883. You can see all this at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. He got into disagreements with drunken cowboys in a bar. The guy had a gun in both hands and wanted to make a laughing stock out of him because of his glasses. Roosevelt decked him with one hit in the mouth. The others in the bar admired his courage, and word got around he had guts. He gained some respect. He worked twice as hard as anyone else on any roundup. He was not a great horseman, nor did he learn how to handle a rope very well, but he pulled his weight and more. The cowboys almost fell out of their saddle with laughter when he once called them, "Hasten forward quickly there." Harbor man, you know. The cowboys called him Mr. Roosevelt as he wished, but out of hearing, at first, it was Four Eyes, or Old Four Eyes. Later, they saw his worth and became kind and friendly towards him. He went on an expedition to the Big Horn Mountains in Wyoming, 300 miles away. He killed 3 grizzly bears and assorted other wild animals. He went on roundup and was thrown from 2 different horses, breaking a rib and something in the point of his shoulder. Still, he kept going, saying nothing of the pain. He appears to never have excused himself for any reason from any part of work. He was game to the core. Some days he rode as much as 100 miles. He even helped hunt down thieves, hunting for them going down a river in a boat. As they were going down the river, Theodore read the whole book, Anna Karenina, by Tolstoy. He admired the cowboy greatly. Meanness, cowardice, and dishonesty are not tolerated, he wrote. There is a high regard for truthfulness and keeping one's word, a hearty dislike of a man who shrinks from his work. The cowboy was self-reliant and self-confident, but maybe most important, the cowboy seems to know how to deal with death. Death in many different forms being an everyday part of his life, he wrote later. Later he wrote, there were all kinds of things of which I was afraid of at first, ranging from grizzly bears to mean horses and gunfighters. But by acting as if I was not afraid, I gradually ceased to be afraid. On one of his visits home, while visiting his sister, his old friend and love, Edith Carow, was waiting at the top of the stairs. Here began a relationship that had been cut short by his marriage to Alice Lee. They started seeing each other and became secretly engaged. In late 1886, they were married in England. Edith had remained devoted to him all those years. Her long wait for him was at last over. They would have 5 children together, 4 boys and 1 girl. His daughter by his first wife, Alice, came to live with them when she was 3. And here, I'll kind of fade away from his life here. As you all know, he became, gosh, he did everything. He became the police commissioner. He became governor of New York. I mean, it's so much stuff that you can't even, say it all in an hour. Governor of New York. He became the secretary of the Navy, and he almost single-handedly started the Spanish-American War, all by himself. His father had, during the Civil War, had paid somebody to fight for him. And back then, that was quite, if you were rich and didn't want to do it, you could do that. And the reason why the man did it was because he had married a Southern belle. And they just had these incredible arguments about, you can't go kill my brother, his mother would say. And so to keep some peace in the family, the man did this. And then he did some volunteer work for the troops. I mean, he wasn't completely out of it, but he did not get out there and fight. And in little Theodore's mind, that was terrible, that he never did that. He never got out there and fought. So Roosevelt, of course, became a colonel in the Spanish-American War. And I think this was kind of a way of kind of like, I finally have found some way to kind of show up the old man. Because the old man in his eyes was perfect, more or less. And so he went up San Juan Hill and shook hands with some dying guy and told him, "Isn't this wonderful? God, I'm having such fun." And And so in the end, that crusade got him a lot of publicity. And when he got back, he was asked to be vice president to McKinley. And when McKinley died, he became president, and then he was reelected for another term. And so he was a president from about 1901 to about, I guess handed over the power to Taft in 1909. And his response, because this was an emotional issue probably for him, and he was unhappy about it, he went on an African safari, and killed animals. So this was his way of fighting his problems with emotion and depression. He just kept himself going so hard that he never really had to stop and think about it. So this brings me towards the end of his life. And this part of it is fascinating in my mind. I just want to say that I've quoted quite heavily from this book, and I haven't been able to mention it every time. And I want this lady to know Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, The River of Doubt by Candace Mildred is a wonderful book. And if you guys ever get a chance to read it, it reads like fiction. It's an amazing tale. It sounds like something somebody made up. And please do. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. At the end of 1912, Theodore Roosevelt came out of retirement and ran again for the president on the third party ticket, the Bull Moose Party, against both the Republican Party and against the Democratic Party. His candidacy split the Republican Party's votes, allowing Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency. The whole controversy, Roosevelt running and losing, and Wilson winning, Wilson, a man that Theodore did not like, sent him into depression. Whenever Roosevelt had a difficult time in his life, he would seek dangerous, rough physical activity to counteract the pain. He did this when his father died. He did this when his wife died, his first wife died. And now, because he had failed to get the presidency, he was doing it again. After a speaking tour in Brazil in late 1913 and the beginning of 1914, in February of 1914, he and about 20 other men, some of them were Americans, some of them were Brazilians, set off across Brazil to the River of Doubt. Have any of you been to Brazil? Have any of you been to the River of Doubt? I didn't think so. Roosevelt and his party of explorers set off across 400 miles of Brazilian highland. They went through open plains, scrub forests, barren deserts, dense jungles. Roosevelt and his 20 companions were tortured by hordes of sandflies, horseflies, small stingless bees that swarmed around their hands and face and congregated in the corners of their eyes and lips. Theodore was 55 years old in 1914. He was 5'8" and he weighed 220 pounds and was blind in one eye. He was in questionable health. Roosevelt had paid little attention to the organization of the trip. He had left the planning in the hands of others. Even before they left, they came to the realization they had boats that weighed close to 800 pounds apiece, too heavy to carry so long a way, and were abandoned at the beginning of the trip. They would have to depend on handmade canoes made by the Indians that accompanied them. They also realized they might not have enough rations. Whoever did the rations felt that they could just hunt along the way also. Well, this proved to be very difficult. So they ended up going on half rations. Nevertheless, even though the temperature was between the mid-80s and 102, with 100% humidity, Roosevelt, always the adventurer, ready for anything, impressed everyone with him by being warm and affable. More interested in hearing about other achievements and ambitions than talking about himself. As one of his party wrote later, Roosevelt was the life of the party. He was fun and lighthearted, and I never saw a man who talked so much. He would talk all the time, when he was swimming, all the time during meals, traveling in the canoe and at night around the campfire. He talked endlessly on all conceivable subjects. During their trip to the river, they got up a hunting party. Later that afternoon, one of the remaining men saw the party coming back. I saw Colonel Roosevelt and his son Kermit. His second son Kermit was in Brazil anyway, working building bridges or building railroads. I can't remember which. And his wife, Edith, also accompanied him to Brazil, but then she didn't go down the river with him. But anyway, she was so worried about her 55-year-old husband doing this that she asked her second son to accompany him. And thank God he did, because if it probably hadn't been for Kermit, Roosevelt would have never gotten out of that jungle. Anyway, I saw the colonel and his son Kermit dragging a Brazilian officer after them through the jungle. I shall never forget the awesome appearance of the intrepid colonel as the falling rays of sun lit up his dusty and begrimed features. His clothes were torn to tatters, and Kermit was in the same condition, but Kermit did not have his father's warlike look. "Are you all right, Colonel?" I called out. "I'm bully," Roosevelt replied. The next day, Roosevelt and Kermit went about the camp as if nothing had happened out of the ordinary. The Brazilians were laid up for 2 days. After that hunting trip, the Indians regarded Roosevelt with awe. As they got closer to the river, some of the men dropped out, and some were asked to leave. One fellow got malaria. Another gentleman, who was a father of the Roman Catholic Church, decided he was to be carried on a divan chair. You've seen the Pope carried in this fashion. This man was in his late 60s, early 70s. Roosevelt and his men were rendered almost speechless when this man brought this up. The good father went on to say that in Peru, carrying a member of the Roman Catholic Church in such a fashion was an honor worth disputing. In the end, Roosevelt told the father, "Since you cannot ride a horse, you had better make your way back home." So they weren't going to do that. They're going to have a hard enough time. As they came closer to the river, they stumbled upon a grave of 2 Brazilian soldiers and an army officer who had been murdered by Brazilian Indians. They were buried vertically, with their heads and shoulders sticking out of the ground. To Roosevelt, this trip was to have been an interesting tour, but something to get his mind off himself, a tour of enjoyment. At that moment, it must become clear to Roosevelt and the men with him how the tour of enjoyment just might turn out as they viewed the dead bodies. In reaching the River of Doubt, they had now come to the hardest part of the trip. Only thing was, they had reached the limit of their endurance. They had already been through hell just to get to the river. They had spent a month sloshing through mud, with long days on muleback. It had rained almost all the time. They had suffered illness, worry, death, and sorrow. They were homesick and exhausted and worried about the river, the descent, and they were even worried about each other. On February 27th, 1914, they started down the River of Doubt. The river was so tightly coiled that at times it doubled back on itself in every direction. The jungle stretched dense and untouched to the horizon. It rained all the time. The temperature was in the mid to high 80s. Their clothes were wet all the time. Soon they forgot what dry clothes felt like. They felt isolated and unsure. When they came to a waterfall or rapid, they had to put the canoes to land and drag, carry, or pull the canoes through the jungle. The jungle was full of strange noises that would shatter the forest silence and set the men's nerves on edge. Most of the noises they could not explain. These noises were gone as soon as they came. The British naturalist Henry Bates wrote 50 years earlier, "Often in the still hours of midday, a sudden crash would be heard, resounding afar through the wilderness, as some great boulder or an entire tree had fallen to the ground. There are besides many sounds which it is impossible to account for. I found the natives generally as much at a loss in this respect as myself. Sometimes a sound is heard like a clang of an iron bar, against a hard, hollow tree, or a piercing cry rents the air. These are not repeated, and the succeeding silence tends to heighten the unpleasant impression which they make on your mind. At night, it was terrifying. It was very terrifying, causing sleepless nights, trying to imagine the source of each spine-chilling noise that echoed in the darkness. The screams, crashes, clyings, and cries of the Amazon night were all made more disturbing because they often provoked an apparent terror among unseen inhabitants of the jungle themselves. Let there be the least break in the harmony of sound, one man in Roosevelt's party wrote, and instantly there succeeded a death-like silence, while all living things waited in dread for the inevitable shriek that follows the night prowler's steady spring. For Roosevelt, the river of doubt was a near-death experience. While trying to get a canoe to shore, he hit his shin on a boulder and reopened an injury from a trolley car accident in 1902. Within 24 hours of that re-injury, the leg was infected. That alone, along with malaria, put Roosevelt near death. He lay most of the time in a high fever, in a state of semi-consciousness, sweat-soaked, in a trance-like state, repeating the opening lines to Kubla Khan. Someone had to be with him at all times. At times he could walk with the help of others, at times he had to be carried. It was during this time, towards the end of their trip, that one Brazilian named Julio started to steal food. Caught in the act, his superiors gave him what for? A little while later, Julio stole again. Remember, they were on half rations, and their rations were getting less and less. Again, he was told off in anger. Julio, going back to camp, picked up a rifle and returning to find the man that had put him down so hard. Meeting him along the way, Julio shot and killed him. Then he ran into the jungle, losing his rifle along the way. This rifle would later be picked up by Roosevelt's men. At this time, Roosevelt was physically frail but alert. On hearing what happened, to the dismay of all who was with him, Roosevelt suddenly pulled himself to his feet, lunged for the same group of rifles that Julio had taken as his murder weapon. He ordered his son and another man to watch the canoe and supplies. He set off to warn another man who was in charge of men also, with a rifle in his hand. Before we could stop him, one of his men wrote, he started down the path where Julio disappeared without hesitation. He himself chose to go back over a trail on which a murderer might be concealed. Roosevelt found the murdered man and struggled on with his infected leg. He continued to make his way to the last camp, searching for any signs of Julio. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that to me speaks of a very heroic fellow. I mean, he didn't have to do this, but he did. After finding the other man in charge all right, some of the other men walked back to camp looking for Roosevelt. When I met him, Rondon recalled, he was very penned up. Julio has to be tracked, arrested, and killed, Roosevelt barked when he saw Rondon. In Brazil, that is impossible, Rondon answered. When someone commits a crime, he is tried, not murdered. Roosevelt was not convinced. He who kills must die, Roosevelt said. That is the way of my country. Julio was found 3 days later. As the exhibition made its way down, they heard a cry, "Senor Colonel!" The words hung with desperation. Julio was clinging to a tree branch. They were shocked how pathetic Julio looked, crouched in the snarled tree, imploring for mercy, asking the men to receive him aboard. He was, Roosevelt wrote, a strange mixture of ferocity and cowardice. It is now impossible for me to stop the canoe and interrupt the survey, Rondon called coldly to the desperate man. Besides, it is best to wait for Mr. Roosevelt. Rondon returned to his survey charts, and Julio watched in horror as the river swiftly carried his commander's canoe downstream. The man in the other 3 dugouts gave him even less hope. They refused to look at the murderer, much less help him, passing by his tree in stony silence. After much passionate talk between them, in the end, they did as Roosevelt insisted. Not able to kill him under Brazilian law, they abandoned Julio to his fate in the jungle. Roosevelt ended his trip down the River of Doubt flat on his back, laying on a bed of jagged food canisters. So ill with malaria and bacterial infection, he could not even sit up, much less rise to have his pictures taken with the 13 surviving comrades, posed by a plaque that officially renamed the River of Doubt after Theodore Roosevelt. The three men did not make it. One to drowning, one to murder, and one to abandonment in the jungle. Theodore Roosevelt was an amazing man. I think he's the most multi-faced historical figure I have ever studied. He comes down through the years with charisma, a forceful and powerful personality. He could be saccharine sweet and very macho. He loved birds and knew everything about them, and yet he still liked to kill them for pleasure. And this is the weird, I mean, they all did this. This is the weird double standard that these Victorian dudes, these American Victorians, did. They like, Custer loved horses, but he had no qualms of riding one into battle and have it shot out from under him. He just got another one. And you know, Roosevelt loved animals. He was a naturalist, but he liked to go out and kill them too. So it was a very odd little way. He was a child and an adult. You must remember, Henry Adams said, the president is about 6. He loved to take dignitaries and congressmen on wild hikes through the woods, not using a path or a road, but going over fields, over fences, through water, climbing mountains, rocks, and rock walls. It was over, under, through. He was one of the greatest romantics that ever lived, with his wild and passionate love for his first wife, Alice Lee, and his love of the cowboy life with his buckskin coat and pants, his silver spurs and buckle and rifle all made by Tiffany's. Theodore was a true Westerner. Born of the upper class, a Harvard graduate, he was a cowboy, a writer of 35 books, a lieutenant colonel, a rough rider, governor, big game hunter, a lover of books, poetry, and president of the United States. He could count among his friends Owen Wister, Henry Adams, Frederick Remington, and Buffalo Bill Cody. And he was hurt. He spent his life hurt. He had to hang on to that optimism, those high spirits, that funny sense of humor very tightly, for melancholy lay just below the surface. Black care, he wrote, rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. And Roosevelt's pace was fast, very fast indeed. Yet it would be black care that would get him in the end. In the end of his life, just 60 years old, he lost in World War I his youngest son, Quentin, the child most like himself. Roosevelt was a war lover. He had encouraged all his sons to go to war by example, if nothing else, and now Quentin was dead at just 19 years old. In the last few months of his life, he wrote a friend, "There is not one among us that a devil does not dwell. On some point, and at some time, that devil masters each of us. It is not being in the dark house, but having left it, that counts. January 6, 1919, the lion was dead. And thank you very much. The gentleman in the back, he said that he met one of Roosevelt's son in Scotland, and the son died in the invasion of Normandy. Is that what you said? And the other lady just asked me what he died of. Well, that trip down the River of Doubt broke his health. He never really recovered from it. They had to get an ambulance and have him carried away. But he did start to get better on the boat back. And there is a picture of him standing up with a cane. He lost 55 pounds. And he never got over that malaria. Malaria, evidently, when you get malaria in that time, there was nothing they could really do for you except give you quinine. And it would reoccur. And it would always reoccur on him. The infection in his leg, it kind of went away, but it never really got very good. And they were also on that trip down the river out there worried about his heart for some reason. For some reason, he was having some kind of trouble breathing, or he looked like he was in distress in that way. So all this, he never really got over any of it. And he never really got his health back, even when he got back to the United States. So most historians, and I do too, feel that broke his health so much that it killed him in the end. His health just deteriorated further and further. He spent time in the hospital. He had trouble with his ears. I think what he died was heart failure. He died at night. He went to bed. He had trouble during the day. He felt like he couldn't breathe. And he went to bed and went to sleep, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, he just passed away in his sleep. And he was really lucky to go that way because he did everything in his power to go in other ways. The question was, wasn't he instrumental in establishing national parks? Yes. Yes, I think he established like 20 of them or something. I mean, he did this in very quick succession. He even asked the guys in Washington, said, is there any law against that? And they said, no, none on the books. He goes, bully, and he just signed them all off, man. This gentleman wants to know, where did the River of Doubt end? I believe it ended in the Amazon. It took a month, and it was the month from, pardon the French, hell. It was a terrible trip, and he must have been nuts to do it. I just don't know what possessed him. But anyway, this was him, though. I mean, he finally went on a trip that just stopped him in his tracks. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Kendall, I really enjoyed your talk, and a couple of things that you didn't mention maybe, but one of them would be the Great White Fleet. It was Roosevelt who had all of his Navy ships painted white, and they made a trip around the world to emphasize to the world that we were Navy power. The other thing I wanted to mention was that when I was in training for the North African invasion as a young naval officer in Rosny, Scotland, I heard this loud voice. You could hear him everywhere. And I looked over, and there was a little short brigadier general, must have been about 5 feet tall, with a booming voice. And I learned that was Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. Yeah. And
that was his son.
His son. We saw him regularly around there, and when you didn't see him, you could hear him.
Yeah. Did you ever meet him?
Yeah, I met him briefly. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And because it was a small group.
How tall was he?
Well, I thought he was about 5 feet.
Oh, he must have been taller than that.
He was very.
Roosevelt was 5'8".
This guy was very, very short. That's the thing that surprised me. And so he was around there until, I don't know if he made the North African invasion.
Uh-huh.
But I do know that he made the invasion at Normandy, and that's where I read that he was killed. I think
really?
he went on the first wave, and he was one of the first people who was killed there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tragedy.
So,
yeah.
I
know his Roosevelt's second wife, Edith, lived to 1948.
Yeah, she's a nice woman.
And she lost Kermit, and she lost Ted, I think those are the only two kids.
I thought it was also interesting that he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But Franklin Roosevelt was also an assistant resident.
Yeah, that was in a different time.
A different time, quite.
Different time.
Much later.
Franklin was his cousin?
I think it was.
Distant cousin. And Eleanor was his niece.
Yeah.
Eleanor was his brother's daughter. His brother Elliot's daughter.
Well, apparently he had a love for the Navy like Franklin did, because
Yeah.
Franklin never lost his love for the Navy. He'd even wear these Navy capes around.
Yeah.
And he had his presidential yacht. He loved to go out on that.
Yeah, Roosevelt gave Eleanor away when Franklin and Eleanor got married.
Oh, yeah.
And then at the reception, they had a reception in the same place they had the wedding, and Roosevelt led the entire wedding party out. And they all followed him to the reception, and poor Eleanor and Franklin were just left kind of standing there, kind of forgotten. Because, Roosevelt was the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. As you know, Theodore Roosevelt was the inspiration for the teddy bear. While he was president, he went on a bear hunt in the East, and they couldn't find any bears. And so what did the guys do that were with him on the hunt? They finally found this straggly, sickly little bear, and they chained it to a tree, and then they went and got Roosevelt, thinking, he could kill this, and voila, he's been on a bear hunt. And Roosevelt came and saw that bear chained to a tree, and he said, no. He says, that is not fair that I would come up and just shoot him when he's chained to a tree. He said, that is simply not fair. And he says, I will not do that. And the bear was so sickly looking, though, that he said, you need to put this poor animal out of its misery, somebody shoot him. But Roosevelt wouldn't do it. And through this act of kindness, he became the inspiration of the teddy bear. This is an actual signature of Theodore Roosevelt. Actually, this is what he sent out to people as thanks. This is the picture he used, and there was something similar on the Antique Roadshow. Towards the end of his presidency, he sent out quite a few of these. The one on the Antique Roadshow was written on the same day as this one. So evidently he did a whole series of them, although his signature was a little more prominent. But anyway, this is one of my pride and joys to actually have his handwriting and his signature. At antique shops, I find different things on Theodore Roosevelt, or used to. This is the Illustrated London News, and it is showing him with the Japanese and the Russian dignitaries, and he managed to make peace between Japan and Russia. I can't remember what year this happened, but he did this. Oh, I love this. He did this on board the Mayflower. How sweet. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Here is Roosevelt dressed to go and chop trees. One of the President Roosevelt's recreation at Oyster Bay, that's where he had lived, that's where his home was. Since I am a librarian assistant at Malaga Cove Library, I want to put in a plug for books. This book is The River of Doubt. This is the one I really quoted quite a bit. This one I read about 10 years ago, My Last Chance to Be a Boy. Both these books are about Roosevelt's trip down the River of Doubt. And this one, well, they're both good, but this one is available still, and I recommend it highly. And then there's Mornings on Horseback. I did quote from Mornings on Horseback by David McCullen. This is a great book. It talks about his childhood and young adulthood, and I recommend this very highly. This is before he became president. And then there's a book out just recently. It's photographs of Roosevelt doing different strenuous activities. And it's a fascinating book. Sticking on the piano, I love Teddy. I hope he forgives me for saying Teddy, but He's just like a member of our family. As a matter of fact, my husband looked like him when he had a beard, a mustache. One of the most interesting facts of his presidency was his opening of the Panama Canal. He was very gung-ho to do that. Since I was talking about how Roosevelt is a member, almost like a member of our family, my grandparents, they met in Missouri. And then he got a job, my grandfather got a job working as a secretary on the Panama Canal. And he actually went there and lived. And then he wrote my grandmother and asked her to come and be with him and work on the Panama Canal too. And I got a picture of her on a boat, and she's smiling from ear to ear, and she joined him. She went to Panama all by herself, was something you didn't do in 1911. And she joined him and worked on the Panama Canal. And then in 1915, they married in Panama. And I have her wedding dress. And when I got married in her wedding dress. So this is my only connection to Theodore Roosevelt, really. Hi, I'm here at one of my favorite places. I spend a lot of time here. Malaga Cove Library. This is where I work. And I have a few other things to say about Theodore Roosevelt. One of the things here is it's a quote he gave interviewer by the name of O.K. Davis, and it's in a book called The 7 Wonders of Theodore Roosevelt. It's just been published. Well, actually, no, it was published 50 years ago, because this fellow wrote this for his 100th anniversary. And this is Roosevelt's feeling about himself. It says, "I am just an ordinary man without any special abilities in any direction. In most things, I am just about average. In some of them, a little under rather than over. I am only an ordinary walker. I can't run. I am not a good swimmer, although I am a strong one. I probably ride better than I do anything else, but I am certainly not a remarkably good rider." He's meaning horseback riding. "I am not a good shot. I never could be a good boxer, although I like to box, and do keep at it whenever I can. My eyesight prevents me from being a good tennis player, even if otherwise I could qualify. I am not a brilliant writer. I have written a good deal, but I always have to work and slave over everything I write. The things that I have done are all, with the possible exception of the Panama Canal, just such things as any ordinary man could have done. There is nothing brilliant or outstanding in my record, except perhaps this one thing, the Panama Canal." It's pretty incredible that a man who had accomplished so much in his lifetime and had done so much would feel that way about himself. But that just goes to show you, he's very human, just like all the rest of us. People know about him best is his quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." He got that from Africa. He went to Africa after his presidency and went big game hunting. That's what Roosevelt would do when life kind of got hard. He didn't want to give up the office, but he did give up the office. So he went to Africa and he found comfort in, killing animals. I don't know. Anyway, it said during this little thing, it says, during TR's term as governor of New York State, he fought with one of the party bosses, particularly boss Tom Platt, regarding a political appointment. Roosevelt held out, although the boss threatened to ruin him. In the end, the boss gave in. According to Nathan Miller in his book, Theodore Roosevelt, A Life, looking back upon his handling of the incident, Roosevelt thought he never saw a bluff carried more resolutely through to the final limit. And writing to a friend a few days later, he observed, "I have always been fond of the West African proverb, 'Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far.' The proverb and the policy followed him into numerous incidences in his career, including his politics abroad during his presidency. He felt that way a lot. As a matter of fact, when he sent the big white fleet, one of the last things he did as president, he got this fleet of Navy gunboats together, painted them all white, and then he sent them on a tour of the world to show all the countries just exactly how powerful we were. And it's just like him, he wasn't being threatening with it. He was just showing them. So he was speaking softly, but by the very fact that he was sending out his warships, he was carrying a big stick. And in that movement, and he went far. So it's interesting how he practiced what he preached, definitely. This is something else I'd like to share with you. It's a talk he did in 1910. It's called The Man in the Arena. He did it in France, and he made a speech to the Sorbonne. It's a school in France. And it's a very long speech, but I have part of it here, and this is some of the best part, and I want to read it to you. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spreads himself in worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Good words to live by for anyone.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.